Wasn't holding my mouth right. That's what my mom would have said. So. All right. And I sadly am a writer, so I'll go off script before I know it, but I have to start out with script. So, good morning. It's the second Sunday after the Epiphany of the Lord, or the second Sunday of Ordinary Time, as you prefer. Crap. Got the wrong notes. Of course, I'm kidding. But almost all of the past 100 times I've spoken publicly, it was in a pulpit, and it was to give a sermon, and it does become a habit. But don't worry, I won't pass the plate unless y'all think it might work. And again, I'm just kidding, sort of. Jack left this wide open to me, what I might talk about. So maybe he won't regret it, but we'll find out. You do know now that I am a preacher, a part-time minister at a little bitty teeny church northwest of Enid in a town called Carrier. It's 86 miles from where I live in Edmond. Carrier Congregational. I've been up there for a year and a half. I've been with the Oklahoman and News OK for 15 years, the entire time covering real estate. Most of my job is the Saturday real estate section, the residential section, the standing loan that you can pull out like the sports section or whatever. That's probably 70% of my time. The rest of it is reporting as things need reported, and that includes all commercial, development, sales, architecture, anything related from dirt and anything that's built on it. I like to try to claim if I can. Now we have other reporters that also report different aspects of development and commercial real estate, because sometimes it's a retail story. Von Mar's coming is a retail story more than it's a real estate story. Von Mar, the story. It's a retail shopping story more than it's a real estate story at some point, right? What happens to the Thunder Arena is a sports story, as well as it's a development story or an economic development story or a city hall story. We just carve things up however they seem to fall and make the most sense, and that changes over time. So at first I thought, what do I have to say to a bunch of commercial real estate agents that I haven't already written for the Oklahoman and for News OK? Besides, if it's a news story, then that's somebody else's thinking and somebody else's voice, not mine. And if it's a column, I have 2 weekly columns, and if it's one of those that I've written, well, I don't like to chew my cabbage twice, so I'm not going to stand up here and read or tell something that I've already published. So I finally settled on this. This is not Las Vegas. What I say here does not stay here. In fact, it'll probably be in the newspaper. We call that repurposing. Let's say I have a long story in the Saturday real estate section, and it's long because that audience is specialized, people buying and selling homes or building them or whatever. And it might be that long in the daily business section on the commercial, or rather the general real estate page. That's repurposing. So, give a speech? Sure, I can probably get a newspaper column out of it. But out of what? And I thought, well, I can talk about how to get your news and information into the newspaper and into News OK. Always get that in your head. It's the Oklahoman News OK. It's the Oklahoman / News OK. Avail yourself of all of it. One of my sermons, and I'm already off the script, Lord help me, is that it's multimedia. It's multimedia. It's not just the paper. It's not just this phone. It's not just your laptop. It's not just a newsletter. It's not just a billboard. It's all that stuff. If you want to communicate with everybody, you better be tapping into all of those different ways to communicate with everybody. Or I could tell a few war stories. Every business has war stories. And journalism stories are pretty interesting, obviously, right? They're stories. Or Jack knows I'm a preacher, maybe I'll just preach. And I see you squirming. And I finally decided, why not all three? 3 short talks. I'm going to tell you some war stories. I'm going to tell you some suggestions on how to get your stuff in the paper. And I'm going to have a little sermon. I'm obligated. Don't let that freak you out. If it does, then freak back in. It won't hurt a bit. And it's the kind of thing you might read in my column in the newspaper, and you probably will. First, some war stories. Prop number 1. Pretend this is an army helmet. That's the closest I could come up with. And I know you want to laugh at malarkey. And by the way, it's a great company. It's one of the greatest additions to Oklahoma City the past few years is the family and the company that this helmet represents. And so now that I've stolen a laugh from you, I'll take that off. I have made one enemy in 15 years working at the Oklahoman. I was so infuriated that I kept a piece of paper in my top left desk drawer. And if I ever felt my anger subsiding, I'd pick it up and remind myself of what happened and who did it and stoke that anger. I am a minister of the gospel of peace, but I didn't always used to be, all right? So here's what happened. A nonprofit was out to buy an apartment complex, and the president called me on a Friday, and he told me that they had entered contract with it, multi-million-dollar deal. He had entered contract to buy this apartment complex, and I reported it. And the only reason I did in mid-contract, and some reporters are different, I don't like to report it until the ink's on the paper and the money's transferred. But sometimes there are exceptions. It was a nonprofit. It was Friday. I went ahead and reported it, and in my rush, I neglected to call the other side. I didn't get confirmation. Oh, and it was a county tax-free bonds deal, so that was another reason that opened it up, right? It was public money, so I look at those things differently than I do just two private people striking a deal. On pending transactions, by the way, I do want to know ahead of time, just for planning purposes, but I mean a few days. And trust me, you can trust me. Those of you who have dealt with me know this. If you tell me today, we're going to close on a deal 3 days from now, that's for me to know so then I can make time to report it when the time's right. I am not going to sneak around and rush it in. I don't do that. I don't want to do that, but I do really need to have some time to clear my desk to get, especially, a significant story, because my time is full day to day. At any rate, in the deadline rush, I didn't check with the seller. I thought, it's a nonprofit. It's tax-free bonds. What could possibly go wrong? Oh, Lord, and this isn't a sermon. It went in the paper, and the next morning, the apartment owner called me at the house, and rightly so, chewed me up one side and down the other. He most certainly was not under contract, he yelled. And most certainly not for X amount of dollars, he screamed. He unloaded on me, and I deserved every bit of it. But he crossed the deadline, which is way more important than any deadline. My stepdaughter, was the one that had picked up that phone that day. She was about 14. We had just moved here, hadn't been too long. Family stress with a move, family stress by definition with a stepdaughter, and a second marriage for her mom and all this and that. She's the one that picked up the phone and heard the screaming lunatic on the other end saying all kinds of nasty, nasty things about her stepdad. So she walks and hands me the phone, and she's upset and red-faced. No decent person would do that. He's lucky I didn't go all Sequoia County on him. I did forgive him, but I wasn't kidding. I kept a piece of paper in my drawer. Because I just, anger's that way. You can anger, there's a reason we're admonished not to hold on to it, because we do get something out of anger sometimes. He's forgiven, but I still doubt his character. Here's another war story. In late 99 or 2000, I reported a deal that fell through, and that's something I wouldn't normally do, but it was for Leadership Square. Leadership Square. And it involved two out-of-state interests. So I didn't have any local bridges to worry about, so I burned them, But I wouldn't have touched it if it had been any other building. Well, here are the numbers, and some of you probably know these. You have to. Leadership Square it cost $94 million to build in 1982, 3, and 4. It was finished in 84. $94 million. Bad timing for MetLife, which invested and built Leadership Square. In 94, MetLife turned down $52 million for it. I was told by knowledgeable sources. 5 years later, in the deal that fell through, negotiations were supposedly in the range of $60 to $65 million. I was told by knowledgeable sources. And I reported it, again, because it's Leadership Square. Behold the power of the press. The county reads the newspaper. The county read my story. My story confirmed what the county had been hearing on the street. The county raised its assessed value of Leadership Square from $36.6 million in 1999 to $57.5 million in 2000. That was the most expensive news story I've ever written. $21 million on paper. Not that it mattered that much in the big picture, because Leadership Square sold that April for $45 million. $45 million. Less than half what it cost to build 15 years before. $15 to $20 million less than what MetLife was negotiating for a few months before. And $7 million less than what MetLife turned down 5 years before. These numbers are still mind-boggling for a kid from Sequoyah County that still looks at Leadership Square and thinks, dang, you could stack a lot of hay in there. Just blows me away. Here's one more war story, and it's a sad one. I lost what I thought were a couple of friends a couple of years ago, and a real sad lesson. A reminder that while you and I can get together for coffee or beer or lunch or whatever, we really can't be friends. Not as long as I'm a journalist and you're on the beat that I'm responsible for covering. Someone I thought was a friend was so incensed by something that I wrote, and it was a good story about a good news thing, that they came to the paper and accused me of deliberately downplaying the story. Well, one, I don't have that authority. I write the stories, and others in conversation decide how to play the stories. Now, I can argue for play, but it's not my call. No, I didn't downplay it. I was swamped that day. I didn't have the courtesy of a couple of days head start so I could clear my desk, and I did the best I could with the time that I had that day, and I told them so as friends. I told them so as friends. I was too frank. I talked to them the way you talk to friends. They came down to the paper and talked to my boss's 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 boss. I don't know what I was thinking, big-time real estate executives, and me ciphering out how much hay I can stack in Leadership Square. I could have lost my job, and thank God I didn't, and that's not the sermon. Now, they're forgiven, but we're not friends. We can't be friends. And the saddest conversation I had was when I just had to tell one of them that. Goodbye. I'll deal with you as I will anybody else. But I'm sad, and I'm sorry. And I'm still sad, and I'm still sorry. Okay, war story time is over. Here's how to get your news past me into the newspaper. This is an old-fashioned green editor's eye shade. Isn't it cool? Sadly, it highlights my loss. And now that I've got a good laugh, I'll take that off. A friend of mine bought me that on eBay when I was saying, man, I sure would like to have one of those. Showed up in the mail. Now, notice what I said. You want to get your stuff past me because, frankly, I work as hard to keep crap out of the paper and newsok.com as I do ushering good stuff in. And here's an example, and this is off script. If I get a wire story out of Detroit and it talks about how wrecked the housing market is there, and it's a great story, a great human interest story about a family that blah, 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 whatever. And it's couched within the context of the Rust Belt and Detroit, and that is no market up there. That's a hellhole. And if I put that story in the local real estate section, and I don't have or take the time to put a couple of paragraphs in there myself that points out, hey, this is the Rust Belt, this is Detroit, this ain't Oklahoma, don't be alarmed, and I stick that in the paper, I've done the reader a disservice, and I've done y'all a disservice, and I've done the local economy a disservice. That's what I mean. A lot of people in jobs like mine shovel it in because they got to feed that beast, and it's a daily beast, and it's hungry. You got to fill that newspaper up, those empty pages. And they shovel it in without any regard for really what it says. I pay attention. I spend as much time keeping non-contextual news out of the paper as I do making sure there's context to the legitimate news from this marketplace. That's what I mean about getting stuff past me. And the other thing I mean is stuff that very obviously should be paid advertising. Because without paid advertising, there is no newspaper. And there's no news okay. And we've all lost something if we ever lose those things completely. I tell home builders all the time, we build houses is not news. That's what you do. We build quality houses is not news. Everybody says that. We lease office space. Good. We have leased office space to a new home builder dedicated to the growing, aging in place demographic. You got me. Now you're onto something. But maybe not. You and I still have to talk. I think most people really do know the difference between news and what should be advertising. But if you're not sure, ask me, I'll tell you. No offense, that's my job. Our ad rep's job is to take your money and put whatever you want in the newspaper. It's not my job. No money involved. You cannot buy what I am paid to give you. And I also say you can't pay to keep what we can do to you out. Mr. Builder, if your houses fall off into the creek because you didn't do the engineering work right, you can't pay to keep it out of the newspaper. That's what newspapers are for. That's what, at their best, that's what we're for. Now, there are news stories everywhere, and I'll be glad to help you figure out what yours is if you have one. But it may not be what you think it is, and here's an example from late '99, just after I moved here. Roy T. Oliver, whose name you might recognize, made a little real estate investment, a little $75,000 deal down by the stockyards at 1307 South Agnew. In '99, Roy T. Oliver had not yet bought up half of downtown, so that's not what made it news. The deal was $75,000. That didn't make it news. It was the backstory that made it news. This little $75,000 transaction turned into a pretty decent little news story because that two-story building, 3,900 square feet, kind of rough around the hems, built in 1929, had always been in the same family, and it was the descendants of Earl, I guess Denew, I don't know how you say it, Earl Denew, who founded the National Saddlery Company in 1926, which still exists down there just off the stockyards on Agnew. On Agnew, by the Oklahoma National Stockyards, the largest stocker cattle feeder market in the world, a saddle shop, 1929, 1999, yippee-ki-yay, we got us a news story. See, it wasn't the amounts, wasn't the buyer, here's the backstory. Most brokers don't necessarily always think about the life of the property because, as right as they should, they're thinking about dollars and transactions and nuts and bolts. Well, think like me. I'm looking to tell good stories, not just to get facts in the paper. Now, not everything is that obvious, and the fact is that might not have tripped your trigger like it did me. I grew up in a cattle-raising family. It's never far from my mind. And so I was wired, predispositioned to see that story and to want to tell it. We each have different interests, so we have to talk. I'll be glad to help, but you might have to sell me on your story. And keep in mind that it's a competition. Once in a while, someone still calls or emails me and says, hey, if you're ever looking for something to write about, stop right there. I'm not ever having to look for something to write about. People are lined up to get their stuff in the paper and to have conversations with me and to try to get their stories out. And sometimes it takes a while. Sometimes I'm just distracted or just thick-headed. And sometimes circumstances change to make something that wasn't necessarily a story when we first started talking, it makes it a story. A while back there was the story on the cover of the residential real estate section, the Saturday section, about a woman in Norman who built a house to aging in place and ADA standards. I see her nodding. When she first contacted me, I thought, and I'm busy, right, mediating, house for rent, talk to advertising. It was the second or third time that she emailed, and it was an email, not a phone call. It was the second or third time that she emailed that she mentioned that she was a registered nurse, a retired registered nurse. Got my attention. But do you know what the real story was? She had grown up with a brother who was disabled. And she had spent her whole life thinking about how a house might be designed to make her brother's life easier. So that's what she did. She built a house with her brother in mind for that marketplace. Now that's a great story. And it got what she wanted reported. The fact that she had a house for rent in an underserved market segment. But that's by an ad. That story is what got it in the newspaper. That's the difference. That's an example of the difference in information and journalism or data and a story. Now, if you noticed, I haven't said a thing about press releases or PR or marketing pitches. The Saddle story started with a phone call from a broker. The Norman story started with a plain old email. Hey Richard, here's my situation. And we kept emailing until I saw what she was trying to show me, and it took a month. But I do want to talk about press releases for a minute. A good one is one that gets my attention. And the worst thing to put in the subject line of an emailed press release is, guess. Press release. Yes. Thank you, Lord, and that's not the sermon. I live in a blizzard of if we all do, but I guarantee, I would bet I get more emails than you because I'm trying to people are trying to get something free, right? If they can just get past me. But I do live in a blizzard of emails. And the first thing I see is not the press release, and it's not the email telling me about the press release. What's the first thing I see? The subject line of the email. So put the news there. Don't put press release. Don't just put transaction. Now, if we have an established email relationship, it's a different deal. But if you're just, I need to get this to Richard. God, don't put transaction. Put Thunder moves front office. Put Kellogg leases 100,000 SF in OKC. If it's not obviously local, put OKC in there, or Edmond, or Gaillardia, or Council Road, or something else that says this is local, not some PR guy in Dallas trying to get free advertising. Subject lines that say press release, news, PR, marketing, those are individual snowflakes in that blizzard, and those emails get opened when I have time, because there's no reason for me to make time to open them when other emails are demanding my attention, and other sources of information, phone calls, texts, Facebook posts. The world is multimedia. Everything is screaming for my attention. OKC firm wins multi-million-dollar contract. You got me. Yukon company expands lease and hires 10. You got me. Donald Trump buys Edmond office park. You got me. And it's because Edmond's in there, not Donald Trump. We are happily parochial. It's Oklahoma City and Oklahoma that we're here to report. Donald Trump can go buy an ad. The bottom line is that the email subject line is your headline, and you need to learn it, love it, live it, and write it. And keep it simple. Remember, 9th grade English, subject, verb, object. OKC firm wins contract, subject, verb, object. Nothing beats that. Yukon company expands lease, subject, verb, object. Keep it concise, and I know that's hard. There's a great old quote from Mark Twain and from several others. I would have written a shorter letter, but I did not have the time. Truth. It's true. It takes longer to write short, so I know it's challenging. And here's my favorite illustration about being concise, and it's not the sermon. The gospel writer did not write, hot tears streamed down the master's face, and he sobbed over the untimely and tragic death of his close friend Lazarus. John 11:35 says what? Amen. Jesus wept. Subject, verb. There's not even an object there because it would have gotten in the way. Devon expands. That gets my attention. One more huge suggestion, as simple as these basics are, they have to be learned or they have to be relearned. Don't expect your secretary or an office manager or a business development person or anybody to know how to do it well, not without some instruction. It's unfair to them and it's unfair to you and it's ineffective with me. If I get a bunch of words that I have to fight through, you failed. I remember this, the most important person who works at the newspaper, newspaper, you know who that is? Yes, the guy that throws it, the gal that throws it in my driveway, because if she doesn't do it, nothing else matters. Same deal with a press release or an email or any kind of communication. If you don't get it in front of me, it don't matter what you paid or who you paid to try to get it in front of me, because it failed. Now, finally, I do have a little bitty sermon. I am an ordained minister, and I'm asking for your indulgence. It has to do with property income streams and equity in real estate as much as anything, because it has to do with wealth. On one extreme are people who preach the prosperity gospel. The idea that God blesses people with wealth and riches as signs of God's favor. I know some real estate people who live that. And I ask this. I'm asking questions as all of this part. What would you say to Mother Teresa? What would you say to the faithful poor? What would you say to the faithful homeless? I just want to know. I want to be sure that if you adhere to that you've thought that through. Because if God's blessing you with riches, then God is withholding his blessing if you lose your riches. Having had some riches and having lost some, and I'm using that with a small r. Having had some resources and having lost them, I think about it. Tell it to Jesus, a peasant, who said what? Blessed are the poor. The first shall be last, the last shall be first. I'm quoting the Lord here. I'm just quoting him. So I'm in my news mode. I didn't say it. I take it up with the guy that said it. Enjoy wealth. Whatever it is, do good with it and thank God for it as you would thank God for everything. But beware, blessings from God come with great responsibility. Look this up. You see anybody in the Bible who has been blessed has been loaded with responsibility. Abraham didn't get off scot-free for being the blessing of all the... Right, he didn't. Nobody. Everybody that was blessed by God was given a job to do, given a responsibility to live up to. Feed the poor, heal the sick, help form community, help maintain it, all those things. Stewardship. Now, on the other extreme are people preaching poverty as the way to God's graces, and I have to admit, I had a neo-hippie period back in the 80s, and I tended to think that way. And I've come around, and life, you do come around. Your theology evolves. It should. I hope all of our theology evolves. But people like to cite the story about the rich young ruler, right? The one that came to Jesus in Mark chapter 10, and it's also in Luke, the same story. Jesus was setting out on a journey, and a man ran up and knelt before him and said, "Teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life?" Jesus said, "What do you call me good? No one's good but God alone. You know the commandments. Don't murder, don't commit adultery, don't steal, don't bear false witness, don't defraud, and honor your father and mother." And the young man said, "Teacher, I have kept these my whole life." And Jesus looked at him, loved him, and said, "You lack one thing then. Go and sell all you have and give it to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven. Then come follow me." And when the young man heard this, he was shocked, and he went away weeping because he had many possessions. And then Jesus looked around and said to his disciples, "How hard it will be for those who have wealth to enter the kingdom of God." And the disciples freaked out. They said, "Oh my God, who can?" And Jesus says, "What? For mortals it is impossible, but not for God. For God all things are possible." Well, here's my take on that wonderful story. The man in the story is checking off a list of things. He's got it in his head that he can get in good with God by making sure he has the right list of things to do and making sure that he does them. And he does. He says he does. Keep the commandments, which Jesus summed up as love God and love your neighbor as yourself. Right? So the young man should have been relaxed into God, should have been trusting God, but he's not. What else? What else can I do? What else, Lord? What else can I do? So Jesus, the teacher of wisdom, says, you need humility. This'll do it. Sell all you have and give it away, and come follow me. It's not wealth that's the problem. It's the denial of the responsibility that comes with it and the power that comes with it. The power to bawl out 14-year-old girls on the phone when you're really angry at their stepdad. My own pitiful power to try to cultivate and maintain that anger for years with that paper in my desk drawer. The power, quite possibly, to manipulate negotiations over a property transaction by getting them past a usually suspicious editor and into the paper. The power to threaten someone's job because your ego got bruised. Power does corrupt. So enjoy your wealth, whatever it is, and if you're in this room, you've got wealth. Thank God for it, as we should thank God for everything. Be mindful of those you've helped along the way, but who have also helped you along the way. We should all admit whose shoulders we're standing on, I believe. Wealth earned or awarded, upscale, middle class, or oil-field working wages. comes with power and leverage and with great responsibility. May we all live up to our responsibility. Amen, and thank you.